So returning to the idea of the profit maximizing firm, having gone through the revenue side, we are now going to spend quite a bit of time on the cost side. And the way we're going to think about costs is we're going to start by learning a little bit about costs and the way costs relate to the production process. Then we're going to do further deep dive into it in two subsequent sections, one on short-run costs and one on long-run costs. So let us begin again just by remembering that my profit is the same thing as total revenue minus total cost. And that the focus right now is going to be on total cost. So in order to get a sense of costs, the cost side is really determined by the production process that a firm uses for its production. So a firm is going to be paying for inputs, and by paying for inputs, it manages to make products, and then it takes those products and sells them. And as a profit maximizing firm, it's going to try and choose the amount it produces, quantity it produces, and the technology by which it produces. So going back to our early discussion, what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce. So those decisions are being made by the firm. And so when a firm is deciding how to produce, I'm going to start by noting that in terms of technology, firms have an opportunity or option to think about producing in different ways, and it can produce using either a labor intensive or a capital intensive mode, right? There are also debates about whether certain kinds of modes of production, technologies are really, say, over-dependent on extractive resources. So things like that. So renewable, less renewable, more renewable. But the difference between labor-intensive and capital-intensive isn't actually about whether something is modern or not. What matters is that the choice of technique is really going to end up depending on which technology ends up being the most appropriate in terms of scale, in terms of ways of producing in relation to a specific market. I will give you an example. It turns out that the mechanisms in terms of machines, raw materials, motors that you could use to produce a car is actually not that different than what you would use, say, to produce a boat of about the same size. But cars are a lot less expensive, and they're produced using large factories. Right? Boats often tend to be produced in much smaller shops, not as capital intensive, with more skilled labor involved. And this has to do with the scale of production, resulting in it not actually making profit maximizing sense, given that there isn't the same sheer scale of market. There aren't people buying boats at the same level there are people buying cars. So it doesn't make sense to have such a mass capital production for boats the way it does for cars. Designer clothing is actually produced very often handmade, skill, right? And it's not labor intensive purely because it's more traditional. It's labor intensive because it doesn't make sense, given the scale of that market, to do high sort of production the way, say, you can have garment industries with sweatshops, t-shirts, things like that. So scale is going to really depend in some sense on the nature of the market. And it isn't just going to be, are you modern, are you traditional, and so on. And so this is why we're going to have to spend some time when we look through the theory of the firm to figure out how this firm is making choices of production technology. Because you can end up producing things at different scales and with different levels of production of capital intensity. Right? Second, remember that even if you are producing more capital intensive or less capital intensive, you are always going to have employing workers, right? And the way capital works is that you have a machine, and then that capital is going to end up being very often, not uniquely, but very often what it's going to do is it's going to generate what I'm going to call fixed costs for you. Right? So supposing I have a grill. I've got a sandwich shop and I've got a grill. The cost of the grill is pretty much a fixed cost. I'm not getting a second grill every time I get a new customer. I'm not like, so that's a fixed cost. And so that cost is going to be the same whether I'm producing 1, 2, 5, 20, 50, whatever. To that, I'm going to end up adding variable costs. And variable costs tend to be of two types. One is basically variable raw materials or inputs. So, if I produce 2 sandwiches, then I will use twice the bread. If I produce 4 sandwiches, I will use 4 times the bread, things like that, right? Plus labor. In most cases, the single most important variable cost that any firm faces is labor. Labor is the thing that often varies, that you produce more, you hire more, produce less, you lay people off, and so on. So when we think about how a firm is making these decisions, it's really thinking about fixed costs, variable costs, input costs, and how much it should produce based on those kinds of ideas. If we start thinking about cost structures, then you've got fixed costs. And fixed costs are interesting, as we'll see, because since that cost is just something I've paid, it gets spread out over many goods. That I produce 1, 2, 10, I'm going to pay for the grill. The variable costs will depend on inputs, and then it depends on labor. So not surprisingly, what we start to realize that the cost of production is really going to depend on how much output I can get from the workers on the input. So cost structure is going to depend on productivity of labor. How much production can I get by hiring 1, 2, 5, 10 people, and so on. And on the surface, it would seem like, hire 2 workers, you get twice as much output. Hire 4 workers, you get 4 times as much output, and so on. But it doesn't work that way with production. What we start to find is that when you look at production structures, you have to start thinking a little more carefully about how production actually gets organized and what kind of work output you can get depending on how many workers you've got. Right? So, in other words, I'm going to be interested in productivity. And I'm going to start by looking at total productivity. Right? So here is something to keep in mind. Initially, let us say I'm going to put labor here, and I'm going to put output here. So initially, let us say I got 1 worker, right? This is 1 worker, and this person made 10 sandwiches, right? So over here, no workers, no production, 1 worker, 1 sandwich. Now, let's say that I'm going to increase this. I've got 2 workers here, that's 2. What happens is initially, when I start expanding production, because that's what I'm doing, the second worker won't just give me 10 more sandwiches. So it's not just going to go from 10 to 20. I might be able to increase productivity, that is the output I'm getting per worker, because now they might be having some divisions of labor. So we can be like, okay, you watch the grill, I'll chop the tomatoes, right? So I can start dividing things up so that instead of one worker making the sandwich by being the person who chops the tomatoes, grills the bread, puts the lettuce, people divide up the work, right? And I start saying, okay, when I've got two workers, instead of going from 10 to 20, I might even be able to go from 10 to 22, right? Up here. And then the third worker, maybe I went 22, 32, even 35, let's say, something up here. But what you want to start noticing is that so see, I'm not only going up, I'm going up at a pretty fast rate, right? Over here like that, initially. But let's keep going. And of course, the more workers I have, initially, I will actually get more product. But the fourth worker comes, and the fourth worker is not going to be able to just give me 10 more, 15 more, because now people are getting in each other's way. There's only one grill. I'm not going to be able to go straight 10, 20, 30, 40 like that, right? So maybe 35, I might go to 40, which is here. Then with the fourth worker, then with the fifth worker, instead of going to 50, I might actually go to 40 to 48. And so what you see is, while I'm getting more and more stuff, the rate at which I'm getting more stuff starts to go down. And there's going to be a point at which, given that I've got one grill, it really is not going to make sense for me to hire the 18th worker. Okay, I'm really not going to get a whole bunch of stuff out of them at that point. So what you start to see is that production functions have a very characteristic shape. Additional workers do increase my production, but while in the early phases of increase, I can have some pretty rapid increase. In the later phases of increase, my increase is going to be not quite as rapid. And since I'm thinking about each additional worker, okay, this extra worker, how much should I get? What I'm talking about is marginal productivity. How much extra stuff is the next worker I hire going to get me? So when I have 10 workers, I'm now considering, should I hire an 11th worker or not? At that point, I'm considering how much extra stuff will that extra worker get me? Because that's how I think of production decisions. So marginal productivity becomes crucial for firm decision making. And what we are encountering is the law. This is one of the most important laws in economics. It's a law which isn't which economists treat as being pretty much true for all production. Maybe not all the time, maybe not at all scales, and we'll come to that later on. But most smallish, medium-sized, profit maximizing, price-taking firms operate in this range, right? And we're going to call this the law of diminishing marginal productivity. The law of diminishing marginal productivity. That additional workers add not quite as much, diminishing, not quite as much output compared to the previous workers, right? So the law of diminishing marginal productivity is going to have implications for my cost structure. So it's going to mean that as I increase workers, I'm going to still have to pay each extra worker whatever the going wage is, right? So if the wage is $20 an hour, I'll have to pay the next worker $20 an hour. I'll have to pay the next worker $20 an hour. But while the wage is the same and the workers are each getting paid $20 an hour, by the time you come to the 18th worker, that extra worker is not adding that much to your production. Do you see that? And so the law of diminishing marginal productivity will then mean that a simple expansion, that you keep on adding workers, and that's going to keep helping you produce more and more, and it's going to be profitable, will not make sense. So profit maximization is always going to be shaped by the law of diminishing marginal productivity, because the law of diminishing marginal productivity is going to have an impact on your total costs. Because each extra worker is going to cost you that extra $20 an hour, whatever, but that each extra worker will not end up giving you that same volume or same value for money for the next worker. So diminishing marginal productivity is going to be central to how we begin to think of total costs and how we maximize profit, which will be the next video.